Welcome to ASM Live at the 115th meeting of the American Society for Microbiology. We're here to talk about some important, interesting, and sometimes really surprising stories that relate to microbes and microbiology in the world that we live in. We invite people in the audience to ask questions, join in on the conversation, and those of you watching online, please join us at hashtag ASM Live. Send in your questions, be part of the conversation from a distance. I'm Stanley Malloy, I'm your host today, and we're talking this morning with Aishwarya Navalpakam.
Aishwarya.
And she's from Oakland University School of Medicine in Michigan, and we're going to talk today about Hpv vaccination. Why don't you tell us the basic issue that you're working on?
So what me and my mentor, Dr. Hussain at OUWB, tried to look at is to see attitudes, knowledge, and readiness for uptake of the Hpv vaccination among undergraduate female students above the age of 18 at Oakland University. So we want to see what exactly prevents these people from taking the vaccination, because it was recommended in June 2006, and the vaccination rate is still low compared to other recommended vaccines. And because of the recent stigma in vaccinations, we want to see how we can improve the vaccination rate.
So the recent stigma in vaccinations, has there been a decrease, you think, in the relative level of vaccination for HPV in college students?
I don't think it has been a decrease. Because it's a relatively new vaccine, you would expect it to increase over time, but it hasn't increased as much as other vaccinations that are being recommended.
So why is HPV vaccination so important?
So HPV vaccinations are very important because they prevent cervical cancer. About 99% of all cervical cancers indicate HPV DNA. And now they have new vaccinations, which is Gardasil 9. It prevents 9 different kinds of HPV infections. There are many, but preventing cancer, I think, is a big deal.
How much has this impacted cervical cancer? I mean, cervical cancer used to be one of the major killers of women due to cancer in the United States, at least.
So there's obviously cervical cancer screening, and that, I think, has decreased a lot of the incidence, or at least helped discover it earlier. Hopefully the vaccination would also help that, but again, it is relatively new.
So what are the concerns? Why do you think people are not getting vaccinated? College students, you would expect, would be an educated audience that would understand these kinds of issues.
And so that's the interesting fact. So the HPV vaccination, it's recommended to, you begin really early before sexual intercourse. So kids who are 11 or 12. So at this stage, you need the parents' permission. And with most vaccinations, the doctor just tells you, take the vaccine, and you do it. But with HPV, you need permission. And there has been parental belief that it increases promiscuity or risky behavior, so parents kind of tend to decline the vaccination. And now, because like I said, the media and things saying vaccine leads to autism and things like that, I think may have, at least that's what we're trying to see.
It's very interesting because the arguments that vaccination leads to autism, I think, has been completely and thoroughly debunked.
Yeah.
But what about, is there any evidence that the HPV vaccine might lead to promiscuous behavior?
No, actually, research shows that it doesn't, but our studies have shown that, and I've seen that, but that perception itself influences people. And like you said, it has been debunked that it doesn't cause autism, and it was so long ago, but that belief is still around. And I think that's why it's really important to educate people about it.
That's the hard part about getting information from the internet, when it's difficult to judge what's correct and what's not.
Exactly.
So of the college students that you looked at, what are the percentages that get vaccinated, and what's the issue that you found out?
So of the college students, most so I had 192 responders, and 54% of them are not vaccinated. And the average age of the student population was about 25, so we have everything from freshmen to seniors and graduate students involved. And what we noticed was, again, and this is previous research before I started doing this, they thought that, low perceived risk of acquiring the infection and institutional barriers, so doctors aren't recommending it or it's not covered by their insurance. And I found something similar in terms of the preliminary data analysis, that people, if they believe that they're at risk, they tend to obviously take the vaccination, recommend it. But in general, they themselves believe, each of the responders believe they're not susceptible to the HPV infection, but they believe everyone else is. So it's really interesting. They suggest that it should be recommended for everyone, but they themselves don't need it. So I think that's interesting. You need to educate them that, almost everyone acquires an HPV infection. Maybe not the one that causes cervical cancer, but everybody gets HPV infections. So it is very common.
So why do some people feel that it's not an issue for them?
And so we thought maybe it has to do with sexual behavior, right? So if you are not sexually active, or if you use contraception, that maybe they feel that they're protected enough. But we did find that there's no correlation between sexual behavior and our getting vaccinated. So that's something I guess doesn't impact it.
Some people just feel that they have super resistance, huh?
We're all young. That's what we think.
That's right. When you're young, you think you're going to live forever.
Exactly.
So what do you think, are there particular groups that if you break out the people who aren't vaccinated, does it fall into certain categories? Can you distinguish maybe why from looking at which groups of people do not get vaccinated?
And so I do have demographic information that unfortunately I haven't gotten around to analyzing it, but we have tried to see if it's associated with maybe a religious or cultural background. We did notice that economic status does not play a role, but again, this study was done at Oakland University, which is a relatively middle to upper class economic background, so I'm not sure if that particularly affects it. So that's all I've done so far, but we're hoping to see, because my mentor, Dr. Haji Hussein, did this in Lebanon, to see if that cultural setting itself impacts vaccination. And so we wanted to see if that is different here in Michigan.
And what's the answer? Is Lebanon different than Michigan?
Again, I have to look into it, but there is, again, the cultural perception is also part of it, that not only parents there are also believe that it causes risky behavior. So I want to see maybe future study to compare Lebanon versus here.
I don't know what the incidence is in Lebanon, but I think in the United States, if I have this right, there are roughly 12,000 women a year now who are diagnosed with cervical cancer, and about 4,000 a year that die. Does that sound right?
Sounds about right.
And virtually every single one of those could be preventable by vaccination.
Yep. And interesting, it's not just women. This could, recent studies indicate oropharyngeal cancer, and especially in males, has really increased in incidence, and this could prevent that as well. And there's like anal cancer, penile cancer, vaginal cancer. So there's a lot associated with HPV, and you could save a lot of trouble by getting the vaccination.
A lot of lives.
Yep.
One of the key things about getting vaccinated goes back to the idea that ideally young kids are vaccinated, but the vaccine can also be given to college-age students.
Yes.
You're still within the proper
Exactly.
range, right?
Exactly, and that's why it's interesting because, so once you're above 18, you have the capability to go out and get the vaccination. And for females, you can get it up till the age of 26, and for males, up to the age of 21. So that does give you a long time. Obviously, you would want to get the vaccination before you get the infection, and that's why they target the vaccine towards children before they're sexually active.
We have a question from our audience now.
Hi, I'm Michael Schmidt. You've probably heard of me from This Week in Microbiology. This is a fascinating subject for our listeners on TWIM, and this is a fascinating study that you have brought to us here today. My question relates to some of the demographics from our good friends down under in Australia, where the Australians have a very successful HPV vaccination program, where they have vaccinated over 85% of the women. And what they have learned is it actually creates herd immunity, where over 95% of individuals are actually protected from HPV. Now, our friends in Australia actually make the vaccine available as part of their National Health Service, so it's free. So do you think we could up the vaccination rates here in the States if we actually just did something that we did, 50, 60 years ago when I was vaccinated with measles and polio and all those other vaccines that has actually, improved the health of everyone in this country? But keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thank you. I actually agree with what he's saying, because what you notice is if you go to the doctor and they say, okay, I'm just going to give you all the vaccination, these are all the recommended vaccines, you should get them today. People don't question that, but when you ask them, so would you want to get this HPV vaccination? So I think it's important to just recommend it and not make it more of, make them question it so much.
Along the lines of the question that Michael just asked us, if you look at healthcare plans, typical healthcare plans, do most of them cover HPV vaccination?
It does, and I mean, I think so, yeah, of what I know.
Right.
It does cover, and that's one of the other questions that we did ask. It is rather expensive. It's 3 shots, and it's taken over a course of every 6 months, but it is covered by insurance.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a very interesting thing, because as scientists, very often we think if we develop this vaccine or this therapeutic, we can really solve this major human health problem. But in fact, you need the social scientists to convince the populations to partake of these great discoveries before they'll have that type of impact.
Exactly. And I think, and that's another question that we did ask, do you believe that this vaccine is just made by pharmaceutical companies for profit? And it is, and interestingly, people don't believe that.
Oh, that's good.
So, or at least the population that I surveyed. So.
Do you know what the vaccine cost, just from interest?
I did look it up. It costs, I think, at least over $100 per vaccine. I might be incorrect, I'm not sure.
But $100 for a vaccine that can really save people's lives and prevent a lot of misery is not too much of a ripoff.
I mean, it's better than getting cancer. That's what I'd say.
It's a few cups of Starbucks coffee, right? If you buy them at the convention center, it's very few cups of Starbucks coffee. Oh.
Dr. Moy, I'll give you one fun fact. In Australia, because of the success of their HPV vaccination program, the pap smear has gone the way of the dodo. And most women who have begun menstruation, of course, endure the annual pap smear. And so Australia is actively looking at eliminating the active pap smear because of the success of HPV vaccination.
So that's an interesting point, because fundamentally that would save money relative to the cost of vaccination.
Unfortunately, I don't think pap smears will completely disappear because HPV, there are many kinds of HPV infections, and just because you get the vaccine doesn't mean you won't get HPV or cancer. So there's many kinds that cause cancer. So I think and we will continue to recommend it. That's also another thing we looked at, that maybe people think because they get a pap smear, they don't need the HPV vaccine. So, and there is a lack of knowledge in that area.
Just come back to this, but first I'd like to remind the audience, please join in the conversation and ask questions. And if you're listening online, please send any questions to #ASM Live. So, you know, one of the interesting issues relative to this particular case, you said about 99% of cases of cervical cancer are caused by HPV. I think that extra 1% is simply because of the error in detection, right?
I think so.
Most people believe that cervical cancer is caused by HPV, period. And if I have this right, I think that there are roughly 40 different types of HPV that may have some association
With the cancer,
this,
yep.
right?
Yep.
But the current vaccine protects against the vast majority of the cases. Is that right?
Yep, and it actually, Gardasil 9 that just came out, it protects against the most common kinds of HPV viruses that have been shown to cause cancer. So, and it's, I mean, if you get that, then you have a higher likelihood of getting cancer. So if you're protected against it.
We have another question from the audience.
Hi, I'm Tracy Taylor from Oakland University, William Beaumont School of Medicine. I feel like when the HPV vaccine first came out, there was a lot of billboards and education about it, and not so much anymore. You kind of don't hear about it. So I wondered if in your study, did you have like an educational component, or were you planning to have some sort of educational component to it?
And that's a great point that you bring up. That is actually why I'm interested in this and why I worked with Dr. Hajussain. So along with Dr. Hajussain and me and my colleague, Sean Mackman, we began an organization at OUWB because we are a new medical school. We don't have something that kind of forms a relationship with our Oakland University. So we started an organization. It's about educating students, and we partner medical students, physicians from Beaumont, and undergraduate students, and talk about health issues. And we have already set up with several events. We've had one about vaccines, so we had a Beaumont physician come in. We had an informal lecture and discussed why people refuse vaccinations in general. And so ultimately, our goal is to kind of take a look at the data, see how we can educate students about the vaccination, about HPV, and hopefully increase the vaccination rate. And ultimately reach out farther than just Oakland University, but go back to high school, you know, start educating students earlier, and, you know, decrease the incidence of cervical cancer.
You know, this is an interesting question. I wonder if sometimes by putting the billboards up and advertising, you may stimulate some of the backlash, and by doing it simply through the physician when people will come in for a checkup, it might be more effective.
Yeah, I agree. But also making it, sensationalizing it, I think might also help, because that's how the anti-vaxxers do it, right? They get some media personality to say, oh yeah, don't vaccinate your kids because they're gonna get autism. So maybe we do need to sensationalize it a little bit. That's actually one of the topics that we discussed during the vaccination event that we held, because maybe that's the way to do it.
Fight fire with fire.
Yeah.
We have another question from the audience.
Yeah, hi, I'm Emily Dozier from ASM. My question is, why is there a cutoff age for the vaccination? Why do you recommend that people over the age of, I'm not sure, 21, 24?
21 for males and 26 for females. What they've noticed is beyond that age, your immune system isn't getting the vaccination, it doesn't make it as strong against the infection. And again, you want to get it before you're sexually active because almost everyone will get the infection, and getting a vaccine after you acquire the infection is not as useful. So we want to target it earlier.
The age association is actually a very interesting thing. This is a totally different vaccine, but the shingles vaccine, I don't know if this is still true, but for a long time was only given if you were 65 or above. And the reason for the age limit was because that's the group that the clinical trials had been done on.
Oh, interesting.
They just, you have to start somewhere. And so once the clinical trial is done, that's the target audience, and you really aren't supposed to sway a little bit earlier. As I understand, there have been studies later that have shown you can push it down and decrease the problem of shingles substantially. But, these ages can be really tricky. As we know, human populations are so variable with anything.
Maybe that will change later as more studies are being done for better vaccines.
We have another question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Sophia. I'm from Centera Healthcare, and I have a question. What are your thoughts on the new guidelines for women to get pap smears every 3 years instead of 1?
Every 3 years instead of 1. And I feel like this could possibly be due to the HPV vaccination. Again, it is very important to get a pap smear, but I think the vaccination would offer more protection and you don't need to do it as often. I don't know if that answers.
I think a lot of people talk about pap smears, but many people aren't quite sure exactly what a pap smear does. Could you just briefly tell us?
So it's basically taking a sample from your cervix, and then they run tests on it, and in terms of HPV, to detect if they have the infection. So they send it to the lab. Yeah.
So really what you're looking at is abnormal tissues that might be precancerous.
Exactly.
Prior to.
So it's like they scrape it and see if it is abnormal.
And my understanding of that is when you look at precancerous lesions, virtually all of them have HPV associated with them.
Yep, it is. That is.
This is a really, it's not only very important for human health, but it's a very interesting example of the change in our thinking. So Peyton Rose, in the early part of the century, first showed that papillomavirus can cause cancer in animals. He got the Nobel Prize, I think, in 1966. And then there was another Nobel Prize associated with cervical cancer and human papillomavirus in 2008. So 2 Nobel Prizes, but it really is because of the impact of this. The idea that if something is caused by an infection, instead of treating it, you can prevent it. It's such an important
It's amazing,
concept.
Yeah, it is. And I'm glad that you brought that up because it is important.
I think we have another question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Ariel Gomes. I was actually wondering, you said before that a lot of people don't actually use the vaccinations, just in general, I would say, if they have a choice. But I was wondering about trust in the medical system and understanding the historical context of your area and trust in that, in medicine just in general, and how that could influence actually getting those vaccinations.
And that's a wonderful point, and I think it does have a huge impact. It is very important to be honest, and I agree that choice is very important. I didn't mean to say that you should take away the choice, but I think having that relationship with your physician is important, and I think that would increase vaccination in general. So I agree that trust is something that we should take a look at and, I guess, work at.
Some of this might be associated with us moving so much into large HMOs where every time you go in, you see somebody different. Versus when I was a kid, you had your family physician, and that's who you saw, and there was a long-term relationship. And we've lost some of that was
that
really valuable.
personalization, you know,
It's
having
true.
that relationship with your physician. And I think that might definitely impact. I'm very glad she brought that up, because I think if you trust someone, you're more likely to listen to them. So,
It's interesting because you lose that personal relationship, and what you gain is greater access to experts in a
Right.
particular area.
right.
So we have another question from the audience.
My name is Barbara Ostrov. I'm from Penn State. One is a point and one is a question. So just along the lines of what you were talking about before, sometimes it's good to know some historical context. So Henrietta Lacks, who is where HeLa cells came from, had HPV infection causing her immortalized cervical cancer cells. So that's a very interesting point related to the discussion. And that book is really fascinating if you haven't read it. So, but the other question is regarding, it's sort of goes with the question the last, attitudes towards vaccination in general. Since influenza vaccine most of the time is not required and that's optional, it might be interesting to survey the college students to understand if they also got influenza vaccine or not. Again, perception of their going to live forever, and when they have an option, whether they say, well, I'm not going to get influenza, or that vaccine is all, you know, doesn't protect, and why should I do that? So it might be an interesting
That is-
question. Maybe you asked about it, but to understand their perceptions about vaccination in general when they have the option, rather than you need polio vaccine to go to school, or you need, you know, you can't go to school, you know, generally speaking. So I wonder if you've thought about that.
That is actually, that's great. I didn't think about that. That would be something very interesting to study.
But before you go away from the microphone, since you started giving a plug for the Henrietta Lacks book, maybe you could give a more thorough plug, because this is a book everyone should read.
Oh, it's just a fascinating historical study. I don't know how many people have read it. So I think it's called The Amazing Life of Henrietta Lacks or something like that. And so, I'm sorry? The Immortal Life, there, thank you, of Henrietta Lacks. So for many years, everybody was told that the HeLa cells came from a woman named Helen Lane, and really didn't give the whole story, that she was actually a poor woman in the Baltimore area, and in the early 1950s, developed cervical cancer, and the people that were doing research on trying to develop immortalized cells identified that her cancer cells from her cervical cancer were immortal, and it wasn't until 40 years later that they actually identified that they were HPV-infected cervical cancer cells, and that caused the immortalization. And even though the whole book tells the whole story in the social context of actually how in Baltimore, many of the community people feel that you go to Johns Hopkins if you want to be experimented on, and I don't know, and I'm sure someone's here from Hopkins and it's not true, but this is the community perception. And so it becomes a very interesting way that the community feels about where they get their care in that area. But it's a fascinating historical context of the evolution of informed consent, as well as the science. It's a really great book to give you that interplay of all the things that happened since the early 50s to current day. So
The take-home point is, if you haven't read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, grab a copy, read it on your airplane on the way home, or if you're listening online, grab a copy and read it in your backyard over the course of the summer.
It's on my post-step reading list. I just took my step exam, so that's what I want to do
It's
next.
a wonderful book.
My name's Mike Hagency from LSU Health Sciences Center here, and one of the important points is if HPV vaccination is missed opportunities, meaning the patient saw the provider, but the provider did not offer a vaccine at a time where they did offer a vaccine, like meningococcal. Did you have any data on your college population of missed opportunities?
I'm sorry, can you repeat what you mean by missed
So missed opportunities means they see the physician, they get like the measles vaccine or meninge vaccine, but they actually were not offered the HPV vaccine. I was wondering if you got any data on your college
I
population.
do not have any data on it, but that is one of the institutional barriers that previous studies have shown is a reason why people haven't been vaccinated.
Yeah, we just had a nice visit from Dr. Wharton from the CDC, and she has very clear data. That's one of the major problems.
Oh, really?
And that the
Okay.
pediatrician and other healthcare providers need they seem to present the other vaccines in a very matter-of-fact way, but then, oh, we got to wait and talk about HPV separately. And that leads to suspicion,
Right.
distrust, and then I think lack of vaccination.
Right, that's something to look at then.
I expect maybe the reason for separating out the vaccines is the concern of dealing with parents about the whole fear of promiscuity, being promiscuous.
You know, bringing it up when your child is 11 or 12, I think it would be scary for any parent.
Right.
So, and it is a touchy subject, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't talk about it.
You know, one of the other key things here has to do with the spread of HPV. And an enormous issue there is the fact that males can transmit the disease. And as I understand, there's virtually no test to tell you whether or not somebody is a carrier. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think, and that's a really great point that you bring up, because we think STI and we're really concerned about HIV, but actually HPV is the most common genital or sexually transmitted infection, and it's second costly after HIV. So it is very, very public health concern. It's a very big public health concern. And in terms of the testing, like you said, the only test is for cervical cancer. So there are all these other cancers that you can't really test for, and there isn't a way to see if you're a carrier. Almost everyone ends up having it though, so.
Second most costly after HIV?
Yep. I think it's according to the CDC, I think it's like $6 billion a year.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah. So we would be saving a lot of money, lives, and it is a sexually transmitted infection, so that in itself has a huge impact.
Yeah, that really is very impressive. I wouldn't have guessed that to be the case, given...
People don't.
Right.
Yeah, I think it takes a backseat to HIV, which is important, you know, but again, this is preventable, so that's something to look at.
Well, you know, it's an interesting thing, but when you consider economic costs like that, not only is that a burden for the individuals who are involved, but for our country, if we could reinvest those into improving medical care, improving education, dealing with hunger, it would really have a great impact on a lot of people's lives. And so the failure to vaccinate not only affects those individuals, it, I think, affects us all as a society.
Exactly. It has a huge impact in general, I think. Agreed.
So what next?
So, like I said, we want to go back to high school and farther. And I think looking at males, because we focus so much on females, but I think understanding why males don't vaccinate, because that's another way to prevent the spread, right? And I think that was really interesting. Someone brought up about Australia, maybe see how, using data from that to see how that we can improve vaccination here. I think, yeah, so that's the goal.
Yeah. Sometimes in different countries, it's tough because they may be able to do certain things in their medical care that we can't quite do. But it really is a valuable way of learning a lesson associated with this. Well, I think our time is about up. I would like to thank everyone in the audience for your questions and participation. All of you who are listening online, thank you for joining us. Please join us for the next episode of ASM Live. And we look forward to seeing the progress in this field and other exciting things in microbiology as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Once you're in the BSL-4 space, the only way you can get out is to go through a chemical shock.
It's an unusual room, never seen anything like this. Anybody who has access to this facility first has to go through an R scan.
So the HEPA filters filter the air coming out of the facility, and that will remove bacteria, viruses, anything that might constitute any kind of risk, right?
Remember, this building is basically a second building inside the main building.